This is Bible School Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, KYJC, Commerce, and KMWC, Bethany. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, the Almightier. How money became God, greed became virtue, and debt became sin. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, how money became God. Today, my special guest is Paul Vigna, and he's here to talk about a great book, The Almightier, How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin. Paul, it is a great blessing to have you on the program today.
It is indeed, Bob. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And I got to say, congratulations on this book. This is a great book, and you know I wanted to get us started by reading a part of a paragraph on your book jacket. We can build a better future where we don't need to choose between helping others and getting ahead, but we can't repair the damage that greed has done until we understand how it took over our world in the first place. And but that's a book people need to read. And you have an important message that I think just kind of passes people up.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, I hope so. It's kind of a weird, right? It's kind of a weird thing to say, like, yeah, it's great. I hope so. Yeah, and it's a weird thing too, writing a book about money and then asking people to pay money to buy it. But so there's all kinds of strange ironies when I talk about the book.
Right.
But yes, I do think that there's a thing that has happened in our world. And I think people are aware of it on one sort of almost unconscious level, but nobody really stops to think about how this attitude that we have in our culture really became a sort of dominant attitude in our culture. And basically, it's funny because it's almost ironic. Anyone who knows the 1989 movie Wall Street,
Yes.
There's the famous Gordon Gekko speech where he says, greed, for a lack of a better word, is good. And he goes on about how great greed is and how much it helps and all that. And, you know, this is the villain of the movie delivering this speech. This is supposed to be the speech by the bad guy. But Michael Douglas himself, he said people would come up to him for years after and they'd say, oh, I loved Gordon Gekko. I loved your character. He inspired me to go to Wall Street. And Douglas never understood it. He said, you know, like, why are these people so entranced by the bad guy? And the problem is that, and this is, the book is really a history of money going back about 5,000 years, but a lot of it really focuses on the last 600 years. And what has happened over the last 600 years is that there's been this very persistent change in how we view greed. Certainly all your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the Bible verses that, you know, say greed is the root of all evil. And that is virtually every religion says basically the same thing. From a strictly moral standpoint, everybody thinks greed is bad. Well, if that's the case, why in our current culture, and it doesn't take you long to look around to see it, does greed not seem to be bad? In fact, why is the pursuit of wealth, which is really what greed is, why does the pursuit of wealth seem to be such a virtuous thing? Why are we so entranced by the wealthy? Why do we accord them such respect? And it's because there has been this change in attitude of how we see money. And I think it's actually something that is underappreciated. I think it's misunderstood how it happened.
Right.
And I think it's bad for us. And that is what I tried to do. So what I tried to do in the book was, you know, literally go through history and explain how this happened.
Well, let's start with some ancient societies and how did they transition from barter systems to money, and And what role did the church or maybe religion play in this evolution?
Yeah, and the brief answer is that religion in general, certainly what I'm talking about predates Christianity. So religion in general played a huge role because, and I don't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think that whole idea that, in prehistory we had barter societies and money came out of bartering might be actually wrong. If you read, recent anthropologists, there's a guy named David Graeber who does a lot of this. Money may have actually emerged from basically a gift-giving system where people were making sort of credit and debit exchanges. And what happened is when you get the first city-states in ancient Mesopotamia, the temple was the centerpiece of the city. And most of the city's business went through the temple. And this sort of basic structure held for a couple of thousand years. The temple was literally and figuratively the center of life. And everybody's goal back in those ancient societies was to please the gods. You wanted to please the gods so the gods would, share their favor with you, and the gods would take care of you. And then when you died, the gods would take care of you in the afterlife. And what temple officials needed a system to keep track of all the stuff that was going through the temple, all the possessions. And what they came up with essentially was this accounting system that evolved into money. So from the very beginning, money and religion were very intertwined, and money was essentially seen as a sign of the god's favor. If you had a wealthy society, if you were a wealthy person, what did that mean? It means that you got it from the gods who favored you. So really, what I just said, like, why do we accord billionaires such respect and why are we so entranced with them? That attitude is really, really old. It goes way, way back. So, from the very beginning, there was a connection of money and religion, and our attitudes that I think today they're so deeply buried in our culture that we don't see them. Those attitudes began all the way back there.
So let's talk a little bit about lending and interest, and how was that viewed, and did those views really influence economic practices back then?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and one of the things that I don't harp on in the book, but if you read it, you can kind of see it and feel it, is that there was this persistent bias against the practice of money lending, what in the ancient world is called usury. Going back as far as you can find in the records, if money was invented about 5,500 years ago or so, the practice of lending was invented not long after, and the damage that practice could do to societies became clear not long after. So there is this long history of people being very against the practice of lending. And there is just as long a history of people doing it, and doing it profitably, and doing it despite the condemnation of it. And you have this back and forth through the historical record of people assailing the practice of usury and people committing the act of usury despite the possible punishments of it. And that is something that it just was not resolved for thousands of years. And it was a real friction. And, you could argue to some extent it's still a friction, but it really isn't in the modern world. I mean, you look at it, most people, I would say virtually everybody, still has debt. We all take out debts. We take out loans as a matter of course. No one questions it. So eventually, really, that friction that I'm talking about did get resolved, and it got resolved in the creditor's favor.
So in the book, you talk about debt jubilees. Talk a little bit about what goes on with that.
Yes. So not long after this whole practice of debt and lending comes up, and people start to see how damaging it is, because what they see is that this practice of usury has this sort of persistent habit where people who take on debt end up unable to pay it because of what we today call compound interest. The debts accrue and accrue, and they grow and grow, and people would lose their farms because they couldn't pay their debts. They would be sold into bondage because they couldn't pay their debts. And on a large enough scale, that would become destabilizing to the entire society. So the relief valve that was developed back in these ancient societies was what they called an Almightier, what we would today call a debt jubilee. You would have a king who would either come into power or maybe he took over another state, and he would declare that all debts were wiped out, that they were just no longer in force, they were canceled. People who lost their farms would get their farms back. People who were sold into bondage would be freed and be put back on their farms. And there was a magnanimous aspect to it, of course. Any king who declared one of those, you can imagine, would probably be quite popular. But it was also very practical, because if you have a society where everyone is getting crushed by these overwhelming debt loads, you are going to crush the society. You're going to destroy the society. You're going to weaken it to a point where it just can't take care of itself. It can't defend itself. It becomes a non-functioning state. So the Almightier were magnanimous, and they were very practical. And this practice was probably in place for a couple thousand years. It's not exactly clear. I mean, part of looking at this ancient history, too, is there's a problem of it's all incomplete. We only have the stuff that we've found. We don't know everything. But this practice was probably going on for a couple of thousand years. And then, as I discuss in the book, over a course of several hundred years, you have this fight between the creditors and the kings and the temples for control of money. And the creditors hated the Almightiers. They hated the practice of it because it was their asset that was getting wiped out. And they would try to find ways around it. And you had this whole game of cat and mouse where the creditors would try to find a loophole around the Almightier that some king declared. The king would put in a new set of rules. The creditors would find new loopholes, and kind of the same thing you have today with the tax code, for instance. People are always trying to find loopholes around it. And that went on for several hundred years.
So at what point did it in history did it get to where debt was an acceptable way of doing business, that lending was an acceptable way of living your life with debt? And at what point did that become that situation?
Not long after money was invented. And it's funny, like I said, you had this long back and forth where everybody assailed usury and everybody was against it, and it still happened. And I think it's, you almost kind of see the same thing today. I mean, nobody really likes taking on debt. Nobody really likes taking out a big loan to buy a house or a car or to go to college or, for all the things we take out loans for. But you do it because that's the way the system operates. And I think very early on in history, in the history of money, that system came into being, and it was just very good for a certain small percentage of powerful people. And so they resisted any efforts to change it, and they have been extraordinarily successful in that for thousands of years. So, Bob, really the answer is that it's been going on pretty much the entire time, and it's never really changed.
Yeah, that's no surprise. This is Bob Brooks. We're talking about a great book, one I would encourage you to read, by Paul Vigna. And Paul, I'm saying your last name correct. Is that right?
I'll tell you what, Bob, you're getting closer than most people, actually. It's Vigna.
Vigna, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't want to.
But you're getting closer. I'm telling seriously, like a lot of people get it wrong. I thank you for even asking. I usually don't correct them. Whatever, but,
Paul Vigna's book is The Almightier: How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin. How did Christianity adapt or maybe resisted the changing narratives around wealth and greed?
It's sort of funny. I'll use that word kind of air quotes, So what you have, and this starts getting into the last 600 years, the change, the real flip came about 600 years ago. It started basically in Italy, in Florence, Italy. This is still medieval times in Europe. This is after the Black Death sort of wiped out half of the population of Europe, and it really sort of changed everything. And people had to come up with new ways and new systems. The old economic systems collapsed, and people were open to new ideas. And in Florence, Italy, which was a city basically controlled by merchants, it was a very commercial city. They did not think that greed was a bad thing. They thought that it actually was a valuable thing. But you couldn't say that. For 1,000 years, the church had been very clear that the love of money was the root of all evil. Usury was bad, and no one should be involved in it. But like I said, it still happened. You just kind of, did it. You did it. You did it under the covers. But in Florence, they start coming out and saying that, literally start saying that greed is good. And one of the writers that I spend a lot of time talking about is this Italian named Poggio Bracciolini, who worked for popes. He was the chief secretary for the Pope. And he wrote a dialogue called On Avarice. And in this dialogue, he argues that greed is actually good. It's a valuable thing, that we should actually we should praise the wealthy, people who will go out there, make money, and bring that money back to their city and spend it on the city, that greed can actually be beneficial. That attitude sort of infuses the culture. It starts in Florence. A very prominent banker, most of you know the name, Cosimo de' Medici, embraces it too. Poggio and Cosimo were very good friends. So you start seeing it among sort of the intellectuals and among the merchants, but you also see it among church officials. Mm-hmm. The Archbishop of Florence spoke about it. His name was Antoninus. He wrote about it and spoke about it from the pulpit often. He embraced this idea. A person in this circle of influential friends was a cardinal who would become Pope Nicholas V. And Nicholas embraced it, and he saw it as a way to bring the church back. The church had been going through hundreds of years of schisms where there were popes and anti-popes, and everybody was sort of contesting for power. And Nicholas embraced this system, and he started using the church to make money and then to spend that money on rebuilding Rome, on rebuilding the Vatican, on expanding the church's power. And that eventually got to a point where the church became so powerful and so rich and so decadent that it led to the Protestant Reformation, the rebellion of Martin Luther. And what was interesting to me was that even when that happened, to answer your question about how the church saw this, Martin Luther, John Calvin, the leaders of the Protestant faith, they were very much against what the Roman Catholics were doing, what they stood for, the decadence of Roman Catholicism, the giant churches, the money spent, but they weren't actually against making money. And this is what's really interesting, and this is how this kind of flips over to what would become the United States. John Calvin in his theology was very explicit. God controls everything in the universe. If you have money because God wants you to have it. So you should work hard. You should make as much money as you can. What you should do with that money is you should be very generous with it. You should help the needy. You should help the indigent. You should give back. But you should work hard to make money because that's what God wants you to do. And that theology, eventually, and I'm not going to keep going, I'll let you jump in, Bob, but eventually that idea gets secularized in the United States. And that's how it kind of jumps over to here, and we can talk about that later, but that's how the church so what you see is over the course of a couple hundred years, the church actually embraces this idea of money and wealth as a good thing also.
I just got to think that when did you start writing this book?
I had the idea for the book in 2020, and I think I spent a year or two just doing research for it. And then so probably around I think I probably started it in 2022, wrote it through 2023 and 2024. So, I spent a couple of years researching it, a couple of years writing it. So yes, it took a while.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's a process. So don't you find it interesting that you went through this process of writing a great book, a message people need to hear, and you release it in this environment?
Yeah.
Come on. You couldn't have an environment that needs to hear this message more so than today.
No, look, you're right about that. I think at some early point I realized that however long it took me to write it, I think the environment would have been good, because I think this has become the dominant ethos of our culture, and that's what I say in the subtitle. I think at one point in human culture, certainly in European culture, and going back to Mesopotamian culture, like I was saying, that societies revolved around the temple. Societies revolved around the gods. You were trying to please the gods. You were trying to do what the gods wanted you to do, what you thought the gods wanted you to do, and that was what everything revolved around. Everything was, your entire life was trying to please the gods. Today, I know that most people believe in God, and most people practice religion. Certainly all of your listeners are religious. But that isn't what the society revolves around. The church has, the church doesn't have any actual power. 600 years ago, the church had actual power. The church could put people to death. It could burn them at the stake. It doesn't have that kind of power today. The society doesn't revolve around the church in the same way that it used to. And what I'm talking about in the book is that what has replaced the church as the centerpiece is money, the pursuit of wealth. That has become our highest virtue. And I think the reason that happened is because two things. One, you just have had, over a course of several, I'm not trying to antagonize your listeners, but over the course of several hundred years, the church has systematically been pushed off to the side. Fewer and fewer people believe in God, and the church doesn't have the same power that it used to have. At the same time, because money has this long, long history with religion, and because money has been seen as sort of a proxy for what God wants, I think it was really easy for people to slide from one to the other, and they have done that. They've gone from the worship of God to the worship of money, and it was really kind of seamless, and that has been the dominant ethos in our culture for a few decades. So I think, right now, 2025, you look at it and you say, oh my God, this is the perfect book for the perfect time. But I think this book actually would have been the perfect book for the perfect time at almost any point over the last couple of decades.
So I've got about 30 seconds left. What kind of response have you gotten?
It's been very positive so far. I have not heard one person really bash it or hate the book. A lot of people have really liked it. One thing I really tried to do is I tried to make it a very conversational book. I'm not an academic. I'm not a college professor. I'm not an intellectual. This is just me talking and telling you what I think. And I tried to write the entire book like that. And I've had people say that to me. They say, I really feel like when I read this book, I feel like I'm having a conversation with you. And that was a goal. I was really trying to do that. So the response to it so far has been really good. Some good reviews, good comments. I've been very happy with it.
Well, the name of the book is The Almightier: How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin. And Paul, congratulations on your book. Thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Listen, if you got a question, I want you to go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.